Hello and welcome to Movie Joust. My name is Jesse Nussman, a film critic living here in Atlanta, Georgia. And with me on the other line, two other fellow Atlanta film critics, Jason Evans and Josh Sewell. Guys, it's great to have you back. I probably started this podcast with too much energy because this is kind of a melancholy episode where we are coming together to pour out a 40 for the great Gene Hackman, who passed away due to mysterious circumstances at the point that we're covering this podcast.
So I work at CNN, as folks may know, and I've been covering, in addition to covering President Trump, no comment on politics, I've been covering the Gene Hackman thing. It is crazy. I don't know what's going to happen there, but it is a really weird situation. I'm sure there's going to be some explanation, like a gas leak or something like that, but at the moment, very mysterious.
Unfortunately, if you are here to hear us spit wild theories about what happened to Gene Hackman and his wife and one of his German shepherds, I don't think you're going to get that from us for probably legal reasons. We can't speculate too much.
I think there are roughly 12,000 other podcasts where you can get that served to you.
Yes, but we thought this would be an excellent opportunity to, pay tribute to, I mean, like one of the great screen actors of his generation. I want to get you guys' opinions on what does Gene Hackman mean to you, because I'm obviously like much younger than you guys, and I think when I was he's always just been introduced to me as like, oh yeah, that guy, like, he's a legend. Like, it was a solidified legend by the time I was seeing him in movies.
Can I start with this? I'm going to go ahead and drop this on you. I think he's the greatest supporting actor in film history. And if you really think about his filmography and think about the roles he's known for, I mean, not saying he couldn't be great as a lead, The French Connection, Hoosiers, The Conversation, he can absolutely carry a movie as the main character. But most of his career, most of his most successful roles, he was a crucial supporting character. Bonnie and Clyde, Unforgiven, Superman, The Birdcage, The Firm, Enemy of the State, Crimson Tide, Runaway Jury, Get Shorty. I could go on and on and on. He's not the lead in any of those movies. Even Mississippi Burning, he's like the co-lead, along with Willem Dafoe. With Willem Dafoe. Yeah. He is the guy you call on when you need someone maybe a little bit menacing, not classic good looks, not leading man looks, but you call on him to add to, someone who is going to be the lead in your movie. And I think it's amazing. I made my list of the top 5. I'm not going to give it away. He's only the lead in one of my top 5 films. He is a supporting character in my other 4 favorite roles for him. And that's not to belittle him. I think supporting is hugely important and not easy to do. But again, my hot take is I think he's the greatest supporting character in film history.
Yeah, it's tough to argue with that. That's a really strong argument. I'm with Jesse in that, I was an 80s kid, so by the time I started getting into movies, he was already very firmly established, had won one of his Oscars already. And so a lot of what I learned about his, some of his most iconic 70s performances was in hindsight, and, his 60s performances as well with Bonnie and Clyde. And the thing I keep coming back to is, we think about the great actors having to make their mark as soon as they can because it's such a cutthroat business. Like, Gene Hackman was 37 in Bonnie and Clyde. Yeah.
And he's someone that I always imagine being like 40, like came out of the womb as like a 40-year-old man.
He always looked like your dad or your grandpa, depending on the decade. Like, he was never like, you didn't go to Gene Hackman for like the Ryan Gosling Leo parts. He was always just the grizzled, no nonsense guy, and representative of an era where movie stars looked like actual people. Mm-hmm. They didn't have veneers. They didn't have, Botox. He was just a grizzled guy who, you never doubted the part he was playing. Like, he looked like he had just been a guy working jobs his whole life.
Yeah, and there was something always like intimidating about him. Like,
Oh, yeah.
you know, it didn't matter who
Menacing.
who he was
Menacing,
coming up
yeah.
against, whether he was a villainous person, whether he was, you know, like the coach in Hoosiers or something like that. Like, he was always just sort of like, in my mind, is like, you don't F with that guy. Like, that of just sort of like, that is like the menacing, intimidating principal at your school where you're just like, you don't mess with Mr. Hackman. Like, you don't fool around with him.
Yeah,
and
it's oh, sorry.
no, just go ahead. I'm just like,
and it just,
that image is just always in my head.
Yeah, and he seemed like somebody who obviously took the craft very seriously, but never thought of it anything other than, you know, it just seemed like he was really no nonsense about the work he was doing. You know, like all these tributes have poured in the last few days, and the one I remember was David Fincher talking about how he went to Hackman for the Morgan Freeman part in Seven first, and as they were having the conversation, Hackman was like, "Seems like there's going to be a lot of night shoots on this," and he was like, "Oh yeah, a lot of night shoots." He's like, "Yeah, that's not for me. I'm out." And it's like he was. You know, he took his roles seriously, but also was really practical in the roles he took.
Well,
And you know, even though we're talking about him, and like I said, menacing and all this other kind of stuff, and intense, dude was a great comedic
very
actor.
funny.
I mean, Jesse, we're gonna get to our top 5.
Yeah,
can
please.
I start?
Let's start with you, Jason, with your number 5.
My number 5 is The Birdcage, where he plays Senator Keeley. He is so damn funny without being over the top, because, by the way, The Birdcage is full of over the top. I mean, what Hank Azaria and Nathan Lane are doing in that movie is just so over the top. But he doesn't do that, and he is incredibly funny. My favorite moments in that movie there are 2 of them. It's when Senator Keeley is trying to process and understand that Nathan Lane is a man, and he can't even put his head, like, he's just sitting here befuddled and dumbfounded, and that's Gene Hackman so beautifully. And then my other favorite part is when they put Gene Hackman in that horrific white dress, and he's like, "I knew this would make me look fat." I'm just like, oh my god, it's so funny. So that's my number 5.
Oh, Josh, is the Birdcage on your list? It's not on mine, but
It
if not,
absolutely
we
is.
can go to your number 5.
It's my number 4, but everything
Okay.
that I was, going to say about it, Jason covered. So what I will do is kind of, as a replacement, throw in one of my favorite comedic performances from him, which is Young Frankenstein. It wasn't on my top 5, but, it's in my honorable mentions, and so I'll just sort of put that in instead.
I think the funniest scene in that movie.
Oh my gosh!
Personally.
And I think these days Matt Damon is regarded as like the king of the cameo. But like to see Gene Hackman, who in that era was at the peak of his gruff, no nonsense, conversation, French connection kind of powers, to just be this goofy guy in a Mel Brooks movie for a few minutes was just just such a great surprise.
And pretty unrecognizable. Like, I remember, for a long time, like, I remember I probably knew who he was when I saw that movie, but I did not recognize that was him until, like, much later in life when I was an adult, and I was like, oh, wait, that was Gene Hackman as, like, the funny blind man in Young Frankenstein.
It just shows you how he commits to every role. He's like, I'm just going to be funny, and just shows you the talent somebody has to just, I'm just going to make the decision to be funny. Like, not everybody can do that, as we all know. So, and in part of the tributes that have been pouring out to him, to hear him say that was one of his favorite roles that he did kind of made me feel good.
So what would be your official number 5?
My official number 5 is The Firm. I feel just part of it is because of my age. Like, late 80s, early 90s was my peak Hackman era. In hindsight, I was getting him right there at the end. But yeah, just kind of what Jason Evans was saying about supporting roles is he comes in not even really at the beginning of the movie. Like, a good chunk of time goes by before you see him, and it's a role where he starts as the Gene Hackman you expect, where he's like the cocky old expert who's seen and done things a million times, and by the end of his arc, he has just become this tragic figure who's not really the hero, but stands out from the many, many, many villains. And so, somebody who's just sort of resigned himself to where he's ended up. And it's just a really, he brings a lot of heart to a role that you wouldn't think has that initially.
Yeah, he knows Gene Triplehorn is playing him, and he's okay with that because he doesn't like where he is. It's a very powerful performance. That didn't make my top 5, but it was in consideration for sure.
Right.
So my number 5 is kind of in that similar era, Josh. It's Crimson Tide, which for anyone who's never seen is like the excellent Tony Scott thriller with Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington. Hackman plays the captain of a nuclear submarine, and Denzel Washington is the second in command, and something goes down. They're in the midst of this sort of high tension international conflict, and they might need to use nuclear weapons, and there's a malfunction on the submarine, and a message comes through, and it's only half the message, and the movie becomes this heated two-hander between it's basically Hackman versus Denzel. And kind of thinking back on Hackman's perception as a movie star, this feels like the baton passing of Hackman and Denzel.
Yeah.
Denzel feels like the person who has taken the Hackman baton of kind of, as we said, intimidating, no nonsense, incredibly charismatic movie star who is kind of the same thing. Hackman was always Hackman on screen, and Denzel is kind of always Denzel on screen, but yet they were able to sort of perfectly be different characters in each movie. And there's something I'm going to pose this. Are they the two greatest screen actors of their generation in terms of a lack of pretension and of just sort of are consistently good in everything they're in, and there's just kind of an effortlessness of just sort of you kind of feel like Denzel and Hackman can just sort of walk on set, and they don't have to do that much, but they just have the juice. They can just sort of play any role effortlessly and take charge of the scene. And it really is it's like watching a epic duel happen in this movie. That I mean, for anyone who's never seen Crimson Tide, a movie that you guys could probably speak better than I can of I feel was just sort of tossed off as another cool 90s action movie when it came out, but if it came out today, it would be a huge one of the best movies of the year, and people would be what an incredible intelligent adult thriller that has two powerhouse actors basically screaming at each other and butting heads on screen, and you can see Denzel is up for the fight and is hungry, and Hackman, you can see a little bit of a kind of ooh, okay, let's play, boy, let's play. and just them enjoying going at each other is just so much fun to watch.
That's absolutely it. It's one of those examples of you don't really know how good you have it. That was not a studio priority picture that year. That was just a summer blockbuster. That was just
right.
We would kill for that picture today. We would kill for that.
Absolutely.
Thing. Yes.
And not only that, to go back to what Jesse was saying, you're definitely making a strong argument for two of. I mean, I was gonna say I don't even think there's a question. There are no doubt two of just the greatest actors we've ever had. But not only that, it shows you. I don't think anybody would make the argument, and maybe you'll disagree with me. I don't think you'd argue that Hackman or Denzel are very versatile actors. You don't really see them disappear in a role, but it's
they don't
they understand.
But they feel like they can play any kind of role.
They know where their strengths are.
So, really quick, I was going to say, I forget where I read it. I definitely read over the past couple of days someone saying he wasn't Daniel Day-Lewis. Daniel Day-Lewis gets a role and inhabits it, and you're okay, this is I am watching the genuine article. I think you're very right. And Denzel does fall in this category as well. They are playing themselves, playing that role. And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, not at all. They're both from an era where, and this is me generalizing a little bit, but it's not and there's the the sort of legendary story about what happens when Gene Hackman tries to go to film school.
Yeah.
Gene Hackman's not a film school guy. Gets voted least likely to succeed. Him and his buddy, some guy named Dustin Hoffman. They both get voted least likely to succeed. And it's because he is not the kind of guy that excels in an academic area. He's a practical guy. And so it makes sense that he would stand out in a movie like Crimson Tide that not only has, a guy like Denzel Washington who can go with him toe-to-toe, but a movie in which literally every other person on that submarine went on to become one of the best character actors of all
the
time.
cast in that movie is outrageous.
Yeah.
And insane. If you've never seen Crimson Tide, it is like I think I saw it like once as like a teenager and then like rewatched it during the pandemic and was just like, holy shit, this movie is so good.
Yeah. It's just a bunch of guys in an enclosed area.
I was going to say,
yelling at
that's
each
what
other.
I love about submarine movies is there's no cinematography really. Occasionally the camera goes outside so you see, oh yeah, this is a sub in the water. But for the most part, it's just camera in the face of two people up close because you can't have a wide shot on a sub.
And they're yelling and they're sweaty.
Exactly.
And there's red
very sweaty.
Crimson Tide was my number 6. As we continue, I'm going to, because we're getting off, we're spinning out of control. My number 4 is a film that probably, there are a fair number of people here who maybe haven't heard of it or don't know it that well. It's No Way Out. And he is decidedly a supporting character in No Way Out. No Way Out, by the way, is one of my favorite mystery films of all time. One of the great Kevin Costner films. Gene Hackman plays such a crucial role in this film. He needs to be powerful. He is the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He needs to be incredibly powerful, but he also needs to be vulnerable to Sean Young's beauty. You need to buy that this guy is sort of, in the moment willing to throw everything away for the beauty of Sean Young. Sean Young, by the way, is stunning in this film.
To her and Costner both at like peak hotness in this movie.
Yeah. He needs to be calm in one moment and explosive and unhinged in the next. And I always go back to the final scene of that. It's actually not the final scene of the movie is a reveal that is like one of the great reveals in cinema history. But the second to final scene, sort of the end of the great of most of the plot, is a scene where Gene Hackman, Will Patton, and Kevin Costner are in the defense secretary's office together, and the three of them are literally jostling with each other, and it is one of the most tense scenes I've ever seen. It's just great stuff, and Hackman is fabulous in this role where like I say, he needs to play a lot of different different ends of the spectrum, so to speak. And anytime I can tell people you need to see No Way Out, you need to see No Way Out.
A movie I actually watched on your recommendation within the last year, and I agree. Did not see that twist coming. Crazy twist ending.
It's one of the 5 best twist endings in cinematic history. It is.
Josh, what would be okay? So you said what was your number 4 again?
It was Birdcage.
It was what? Birdcage.
Yeah, it was Birdcage.
So we skipped Josh. We're skipping. Oh no,
I've already talked about it.
Okay. So I'll do my number 4, which is probably my favorite like Hackman as a villain performance, which is him in Unforgiven, which
my number 3.
I believe is one of the
number 3. Yeah,
your number 3. Josh, is Unforgiven on your list?
Yeah, and it, not to bury the lead, but like it's my number 1.
Let's wait.
Oh, okay.
Let's do it later.
Yeah.
Let's wait and talk about it then. So let's go to our number 3s. Jason, what's your number 3?
Unforgiven. So skip me.
Okay. So we'll skip that. Josh, what's your number 3?
My number 3 is, and looking back on my list, I think I anticipated some of the big major ones being on here. So my top 5 kind of ended up being like a top 5 of like 90s Hackman. And so my number 3 is Get Shorty. And and I think it's because he's like we've said before, he is taken so seriously as like a capital A actor that it's really easy to overlook how freaking funny he was. And not just
my favorite part of that movie, honestly.
And not only that, but like as we can see from The Firm and in Get Shorty, like he's really good at playing pathetic guys who know they're pathetic but are trying to like paper it over with this gruff exterior. Like he's such a loser in this movie, but you love him anyway. So yeah, it gets sort of that stereotypical lovable loser, but like he's an idiot, but he's still good enough to get Rene Russo, for a little while until John Travolta steals her away.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's another one of those great supporting roles. I love the way he gets injured and stuff like that in Get Shorty. Yeah, it's there's nothing more to say than this dude knew how to support the other folks on screen and yet how not to be overshadowed.
Yeah, but a character that, like, even when he's not at the forefront of a scene, you see that as the character, his mind is always turning, trying to figure out what the angle is to get him out of whatever horrific situation he's put himself in at any given time. So it's like the dude never gets a chance to just stop and take a breath because he's constantly trying to save his own butt.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys have ever read the Elmore Leonard book that's based off of, but
it's
like
been a while, but yeah.
I remember like reading the book just like at the beach one summer and being like, I think I hadn't seen the movie yet, and then when I went and watched the movie was like, oh my god, he is such perfect casting for like that role in the book. As opposed to like hot take, I think John Travolta is a little miscast in that movie. But my number 3 is another, I feel like a kind of underrated Hackman movie, which is Night Moves, which is this like incredible 70s thriller, like really kind of like twisted, scummy, like private eye movie directed by Arthur Penn, who made Bonnie and Clyde, and is just like a great kind of like, I don't know, it's just that thing that I love about those like 70s movies where it's just like Hackman's just kind of like an everyday guy. Like how like you could be a matinee idol movie star in the 70s and just sort of look like a dude off the street, and Hackman playing this private eye character in this really like scuzzy, twisted, like really kind of like effed up detective movie. Is just like, if you're really into like noir movies, I would highly suggest checking it out. I believe Criterion is doing like a 4K restoration of it that's supposed to come out here in the next month or so. So kind of an excellent opportunity if you've never seen Night Moves to see it for the first time. I saw it a couple years ago and was like, oh wow, Hackman is unreal, incredible in this movie, and that's just the kind of movie I enjoy. So if you're also a noir detective fan, like absolutely check it out.
I'll freely say I haven't seen it. It's one of those films that's been on my list for a long time, and I never get around to seeing it. I know it's considered one of the good, really good noir films of the 70s, which is saying something. So
there's always one of like anytime we're in a difficult moment like this where you're doing that weird human thing of like grieving someone you've never met. There's always, always have a hole in the filmography of them somewhere. And that was one that I kept hearing, and I was like, that's one of those movies I'm probably not going to see until I hear that he's gone. And sure enough, yep.
Yeah. Well, now you're in luck because, a really nice restoration of it is coming out. So kind of, in an odd way, sort of perfect timing for that movie to kind of be back in the culture a little bit. All right. Jason, what's your
number two is Superman. He brought a sense of importance to the comic book movie genre. I mean, I'm sure you guys will know this, but folks may forget that Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando were the top billed stars in Superman. The way they got Superman at the time, the 1978, I want to say, when they made that Superman movie, first of all, comic book movies were not a thing. I mean, like, absolutely were not a thing. And they went out and they made the most expensive film of all time. I want to say it cost like $55 million, which in 1978 was a lot of money. And the way they got that movie made was they said, we're getting Marlon Brando and Gene Hackman. So full credit to him for signing on to what was a huge risk. No one knew who Christopher Reeve was. But then much more than that, much more than sort of the business side of what happened with him in Superman, he plays Lex Luthor with such a delightful mix of like arrogance and anger and menace, but also buffoonery. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
It really is one of the great comic book movie performances.
it
I
is.
think.
No one could scream Miss Tessmacher the way he could. It's so great. And Richard Donner, I think, the director and the other producers, the Salkind family and such, they knew that Superman is kind of a one-note character. I mean, he's honest, he's good, he's honorable, and that's kind of boring. And they went, we need a good villain to make this story work. And man, Gene Hackman crushes it so much that they just constantly bring him back. Even if he's not going to be the main villain, it's like Superman 2, Superman 3, Superman, doesn't matter. We're bringing Gene Hackman back. We have to have him for all the sequels.
Gene Hackman's like the check.
And I feel like anytime anyone like steps into the role of Lex Luthor after that, like it's always just in the shadow of him. Like, even I remember like when that one Superman movie where Kevin Spacey was Lex Luthor, like he's basically kind of just doing a Hackman impersonate, like trying to do the Hackman thing. So it's, it'll be interesting. We'll have this conversation over again when there's the James Gunn Superman movie, and we'll see how Nicholas Hoult stacks up. But like, I agree. It's that kind of like, Titanic of a performance that just like anyone else who has portrayed that character, it's like, I don't know, you're kind of in the Hackman shadow. Like, can anyone do it better than
it's so funny, by the way. I mean, he is a bad guy. He's menacing. He's villainous. And he's also really damn funny.
Yes. All right, Josh, what is your number 2?
Well, I'm gonna adjust on the fly here because my number 2 was originally Crimson Tide, and we've talked a lot about that. So I'm pulling from my honorable mentions, which is just literally the rest of Gene Hackman's filmography, right? Like, even when he was in a bad movie, and he was in his share of bad movies, it's hard to find a movie that he's bad in. And I was like, you can't let a top 5 go without talking about Bonnie and Clyde, which is where he really, after an already pretty storied career of doing some TV performances and stuff, gets to really show what he's capable of as, a dramatic actor that, from his first role exhibits all these things that we've been talking about, that he's, the gruff guy, he's the confident guy, he's the guy who's having a good time, but there's also the part of him that is, there's something kind of sad sack about him and something sort of tragic figure about him. And for him to get to show all of the different facets of what make him a great actor in his very first big screen role is just an interesting thing to behold. And again, like I was saying at the beginning of the podcast, the fact that he does that at 37 years old while still looking like the grandpa that we we know him to look like, is just, it's like he's cut an amber from the very first thing he does, or preserved an amber.
I did not realize that was his debut performance until like this past week and like reading obituary stuff. And I was like, wow, what luck for just like that to be like Bonnie and Clyde, a pretty like landmark American movie, to be like your debut essentially.
I got nothing to add. It's a great performance and a great movie, and yeah, the notion that's how you introduce yourself to the film world is just insane.
Mm-hmm.
So my number 2 is The Conversation, the Francis Ford Coppola movie. I feel like probably the least talked about of his kind of 470s masterpieces, even though I would say it is equally as great as like Godfather 1 and 2 and Apocalypse Now, like a seminal American movie of the 1970s. For anyone who hasn't had a chance to see it, Hackman plays a audio engineer who has essentially made a career out of eavesdropping on people and like bugging people's apartments and recording secret conversations. And he begins to have his life unravel when he begins to suspect that one of his latest operations might have gotten a young couple killed. And it really is this kind of like pressure cooker character study of him as this man that needs to like exude control over everything, but slowly like feeling like he's losing control and like he's maybe not in control of his life and that everything is spiraling out of control. If you really love like 70s paranoia movies, this is, I think, like one of the greats and like one of the best movies Francis Ford Coppola has ever done. And yeah, I think there was also like a restoration of it that came out like a couple years ago because it recently had a big anniversary. Is the conversation on you guys' list? Is it a movie you guys are also equally fans of? I rewatched it last year when I rewatched all the Coppola movies ahead of Megalopolis and was just like, holy cow, this movie slaps so hard and is so good. I don't know. What do you guys think of the conversation?
The ending of that film where he realizes that he's being listened to the way he's been listening to other people and and he goes
haunting,
insane on his apartment looking for the bugs and can't find is like I mean that is an ending. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Not only that, but it inspired like in the decades to come there is no movie or TV show where a character is looking for a bug that doesn't reflect that film.
Yeah.
Like,
and a movie that is like super relevant, like even more relevant today with like the invasion of privacy with like how online we all are and how public our information is. Like that movie, I mean, Jason could probably explain better than I could of like what it felt like at the time. But
well, by the way, really interesting bookend, not nearly as good a film, but Enemy of the State, which he makes.
That is true. It's sort of a sneak sequel to The Conversation of like what happens to that guy years later.
He goes
like,
into hiding.
Yeah, a movie that is like is really unsettling of just sort of like, oh my God, everyone is listening in to me at all times and like zero privacy exists in the world.
He does that quite a few times in his career where he's clearly referencing one of his past roles, but is just sort of passing it down to the new actor. He does that too with like a movie he's in with Owen Wilson, where Owen Wilson's a pilot that gets shot
behind
enemy lines. Yeah, and then, Gene Hackman did that with Bat 21. So there's several times in his career where he's like, oh yeah, I know how to do this. I'll do this for this new guy. It just kind of shows that, I'll take a smaller supporting role and help this punk out and, catch the check,
Kind of like the Crimson Tide thing of like that mode he was in the 90s where he's just like, I'm the elder statesman here to kind of like, help show the new guys in town a little bit how it's done and kind of like provide kind of the great supporting roles.
Curious how a movie like The Conversation has aged for younger viewers. Like when I try to explain to some of my students about Network, how like if you try to watch Network now, there's no satire there anymore because we've surpassed anything Network warns us about. And so when you have a movie like The Conversation where it's like, it's the death of privacy, it's like, but they don't talk about a world where like we all just willingly like know that that's true and buy into it. Like we just click accept terms on everything we do.
Yeah. If anything, as the younger person on this podcast, it sort of makes the movie like that much more profound and kind of creepy in a way of just sort of like, oh my God, like even back in 1974 or whatnot, like this was coming around the corner, and like a handful of filmmakers were basically just like, guys, I'm telling you, people can listen to everything you're doing and can see everything you're doing. So yeah, great movie if you've never seen The Conversation.
And as I speak into a camera and a microphone on the internet, I say I'm just fine with that.
All right, let's all talk about our number ones. Jason, what is your number one favorite Hackman?
I'm going with Hoosiers. I talked about,
of course,
all my other ones are supporting roles. This is a Gene Hackman film. His portrayal of Coach Norman Dale, he's probably on screen in, there may be, I'm trying to think if there are one or two little tiny scenes that he's not in, but for the most part, he's in every damn second of the movie Hoosiers. Probably the greatest performance of a coach, a sporting film in cinematic history. I think it is up there with like The Natural and Field of Dreams to me as like the greatest sports movies of all times. And
is it the greatest basketball movie of all time?
I don't have to even hesitate on that. It's this or The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh. No, I'm kidding. Which is a film probably neither of you have ever seen. I've seen all the basketball films.
No, I've never seen
The Fish That Saved Pittsburgh. Yeah, this or White Men Can't Jump. No, Hoosiers is unquestionably the greatest basketball movie of all time, and it's the ultimate true underdog story. But the thing about Coach Dale is you have to believe in him. You have to trust him the same way the team does for the movie to work. And it by the way, for Gene Hackman, it's kind of a quiet and calm performance. Yes, he fights at times and he gives some great inspirational speeches, by the way. But for the most part, he's playing calm because the backstory on the character is that he flipped out at one point. He hit one of his players, and that's why he can't, that's why he has to go down so far in the coaching ranks, so to speak, to get this job of a small, tiny high school team in Indiana. So he has to kind of suppress something in him. And so, we've talked about Gene Hackman as this menacing figure and this bad guy figure, and he has to do the opposite in Hoosiers. But he dominates that film in a way that he was rarely asked to in other movies. And it's just such an easy, wonderful watch of a film. And so it's easily my favorite performance by him. It's when I was making my list, I was like, "That's number one," and then I had like eight others to think about for the other the other spots.
Yeah. And speaking of passing the torch, like there is so much of Gene Hackman's coach from Hoosiers in Denzel's performance in Facing the Giants.
Yeah. Another kind of the only other person I can think of that's like what's like the great coach performance of all time, and like ironically to speak to our hypothesis of Denzel is the Gene Hackman for the next generation is like who's the next person
talk
that has
about
that.
The varying quality of the films. I know I'm not going to say
they're not on the same plane, my friend.
Quality, but that same sort of performance as this volatile guy who understands he has to keep it under control because so many sets of eyes are on him and he can't afford to misstep once. It feels like there's a lot of creative inspiration in there.
All right, let's talk about Unforgiven, Josh.
All right,
let us have it.
Number one, it's what got him his second Oscar, right? And it's one that I discovered late. It's I was looking at a list of, we all have those holes that we don't fill in until later. And I was never a big Western person as a kid. And so Westerns are one of my big blind spots. And I was like, I've never seen Unforgiven. And I had an assignment come up for a magazine where I was like, I can watch this. This will give me a reason to watch it. And watched it last summer, and it's one of those things where like you feel like an idiot. We're like, "Hey guys, did you know this movie is excellent?" And it's like, "Yeah, you're the last person on the planet to realize this."
One of those things where you're like, "Wow, it lived up to the hype." I get
it. You only watched Unforgiven last summer. I can't get my head around that.
I'll do you better than that. I had to hit pause on the part where Richard Harris is giving his speech about presidential assassinations because somebody took a shot at our current one. So It was like this movie from 30 years ago was still super relevant today. But yeah, to have, and you had heard so much about, legendary Eastwood performance, legendary Richard Harris performance, even more legendary Gene Hackman performance. And so I went in with, okay, arms crossed. All right, wow me, Western, because I've never been a fan of it anyway. And just, yeah, holy crap. And to have a guy who starts out as someone that you're kind of rooting for, even though his methods aren't ideal, and to have him become the movie's true villain, even though all the way to the end you understand why he's doing the things he's doing. And to have that arc in, again, it just goes down to him as just amazing at playing tragic characters, where like one of his last lines is like, I was building a house.
Yeah.
You know, like, you did all this. And he didn't, you know, but like from his perspective, you can see why he would think that.
Yeah, it's one of the like magic tricks of that movie is like the Eastwood character is what you would traditionally think of as being like the villain of a Western movie, and Hackman is, you know, the law-abiding sheriff in town, and then as the movie goes on, you're like, oh, the stoic like gunman is actually more the hero, and actually the sheriff is like pretty corrupt and has a pretty like effed up idea of what serving out justice is, and like the Hackman character becomes way more the villain of the movie. Yeah, it's just like it is my favorite of like him as just like pure scary, like that the switch that happens when all of a sudden you're like, oh, Gene Hackman's the sheriff, I love this, to then all of a sudden like, oh god, like this guy, I don't know how I feel about this character, and he is way more corrupt and scary than I initially thought. It's just sort of an incredible switch that happens in that movie.
mean, I love the way, you know, he has rules. Little Bill, the character, has rules for how the town will operate so that he can keep the peace. And you're like, okay, yeah, I get it. And then suddenly you're like, oh, wait a second. He's sadistic.
Right. You're like, okay, I guess, you know, frontier justice, and then all of a sudden it becomes like, no, don't do that to Morgan Freeman, you monster.
But it's worth noting that Little Bill firmly believes in this stuff. He doesn't think he is a sadist.
Yeah.
He doesn't think he's cruel. He thinks he's honorable and lawful, and that he's here to make sure, even if he has to be ruthless about it, that the rules are kept and the town is safe. So at the very end, you were talking about his second to last line. I'm going to talk about his last line in the film. Clint Eastwood's William Money is standing over Little Bill, about to gun him down, and Little Bill says, I don't deserve this. He says, I didn't deserve this. In his head, he doesn't deserve this. And that's part of the greatness of the film. But on the other hand, we're completely aligned with Clint Eastwood's character when he says, deserve's got nothing to do with it.
Yes.
It's just your turn. You know, it'll be my turn later. You know, but you can see, for me at least, that turn is that initial scene with Richard Harris, where
he beats the crap out of him, and he's talking to him calmly the whole time. It's incredible.
Just unmercifully. And so it's like Jesse was talking about. He goes from, oh, cool, yeah, Gene Hackman, to like, oh my god. And it's like you feel like if you were looking at like an EKG, like his heart rate wouldn't have even gone up. You know, it's just like, this is the consequence of what happens. And what's worse is like when he's telling you, and he's telling the reporter, right, the backstory of Richard Harris's character, it kind of gets you back on his side again a little bit, where you're just like, oh yeah, this guy sucks, I'm glad you beat him up. And then you're like, wait, what am I talking about? Like,
right.
So yeah, it's just, it on paper, it's such a simple character, but he gives it, just like everything else he does in his career, so much depth and complexity that may not just be there initially on the page.
So, transitioning from probably, I would say, Hackman's darkest role to, I would say, maybe his lightest role. My favorite Gene Hackman performance is in The Royal Tenenbaums, Wes Anderson's tale about a eclectic, dysfunctional family in New York City, with Hackman playing the devilishly charming and yet a total shitbag dad to all these kids, basically like worst dad of the year. The irony is Hackman and Wes Anderson didn't seem to get along in the making of this movie, and Hackman did not seem to enjoy working for Wes Anderson. But it's I don't know, it's this is a movie that, like, I think I was the right age to see it when I did. I was like 14, and I just sort of fell in love with it. It's the Wes Anderson movie I probably rewatched the most, and Hackman is so incredibly funny in this movie, and yet there's such a tenderness to him. Like, I cry every single time that scene at the end where Ben Stiller like tells him like, I've had a really tough year, Dad, and Hackman just says, I know, son. And like I'm always just like a puddle of tears of that moment. And I don't know, it's one of his last performances before he retired, but he still has such a like pep in his step, and I think it is one of the best performances in any Wes Anderson movie. And just Hackman's kind of like silliness and joy that he's having in every single moment is so contagious. I don't know. What do you guys think about him and Royal Tenenbaums?
Go for it, Jason.
Well, I was going to say that's such a great ensemble piece, the Royal Tenenbaums. But Hackman to me does stand out because he's sort of the driving force of so much of what happens with all these different characters, and it's a tragedy of him ruining the lives of his incredibly talented, amazing kids. Yeah, it's a wonderful, brilliant performance. And by the way, I love at the end that the epitaph, the final words on his tombstone, he writes them himself, and it's ridiculous. Yes. It has no bearing on reality at all. It's a great performance. Jesse, you were talking about him not getting along with Wes Anderson. Can't you just picture like them doing a second or third take and Hackman being like, we got it, and Anderson being like, let's try this thing different, and Hackman being like, dude, what? I'm in my 60s or 70s. What are you doing to me?
Yeah. And it's so fun because like you watch it and it doesn't, it's not like a, Harrison Ford in Blade Runner, even though I think Harrison Ford's like great in Blade Runner, but like, Harrison Ford seems undeniably like grumpy and does not want to be there in that movie. But like Hackman seems like he's having a ball, and like it is the weird thing of like I guess the other it must have just been, like there's the stories about like Burt Reynolds and Paul Thomas Anderson like butting heads on Boogie Nights. Mm-hmm. Like I wonder if just like part of it was, I'm a veteran actor, like you said, Jason, like I'm in my 60s, just like, who is this like early 30-something guy that's just like asking me to do another take, basically? Or like in the Burt Reynolds case, like 26-year-old Paul Thomas Anderson being like, can you do it this way, Burt? And Burt Reynolds being like, do you know who you're talking to?
Yeah, I'm Burt Reynolds. But and to be fair, it's that for all the behind the scenes conflict, it kind of fits the nature of the film a little bit. And one of the things about his performance in that movie is, for better or worse, I was going to say Paul Thomas Anderson, but Wes Anderson has developed this reputation for characters who represent things rather than being actual people. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, Gene Hackman is in rarefied air with other actors like Ralph Fiennes in Grand Budapest, who you can see that character as an actual living, breathing human being, a weird human being, but not this sort of like twee invention of a literary character. You could
there's
see
a
this person out in the
to
world.
The performance that I think helps it stand out amongst like, I'm a big Wes Anderson defender at this point of thinking he's like underrated almost. But,
how's that even possible?
Like, I just feel like in the whole like, we can put a pin in this and maybe we'll do like there's a Wes Anderson movie this year. We'll get a chance to talk about it. But I feel like in the whole like AI Wes Anderson thing, like and the reception to his last couple movies, I feel like people have just sort of boiled down him to just sort of like, oh, he does this one thing every single time. But I agree with you, Josh. I think there's a looseness about Hackman similar to Ralph Fiennes in Grand Budapest that sort of like really stands out amongst the performances in the rest of that body of work. And like, it just makes it, I really do think it's like one of the best performances in any Wes Anderson movie. And
absolutely, because I mean, you compare it to something like, and I'm just no no digs at these actors. It was just the first one that popped in my head. Like, for instance, like Scarlett Johansson in Asteroid City. I was trying to go recent. Like, she's great in the film. And, you know, the character is interesting, but you don't look at that character and go, that's a real person who lives in the world.
No way.
You know,
no one in Asteroid City lives in the real world.
That's a fair point too. Yeah.
Right.
So, but to look at somebody like Gene Hackman and Royal Tenenbaums, you'd be like, it seems like you could see that guy on the street. You'd look at that guy and be like, that's a weird looking guy, but it seems like a guy that you would see.
Well,
I love the moment where him and Ben Stiller Ben Stiller pulls him into the game closet and is like trying to scream at him for something, and Hackman's just looking around like, wow, I've never been in here in years.
Well, I think we've hit on one of the things about Gene Hackman that made him so unique, which is, you know, going back to sort of where we were at the beginning. He does not have the Hollywood classic good looks. You know, not attractive man, but he's not. You don't look at him and say, oh, that's a star. You look at him and you say, that's every man. That's a guy in the street. The plumber who came over the other day, that could be Gene Hackman. If Leonardo DiCaprio came over to do your plumbing, you'd be like, what the hell? It's Leo. You know, Hackman was very different. And the other thing I wanted to mention is as we get close to wrapping up, I think it's amazing that our lists, usually if you said top 5, there'd be so much overlap. There wasn't that much.
Yeah, I love how different we all were.
There wasn't that much over. I mean, like, my number 1, Jesse's number 1, didn't show up in anybody else's top 5, and yet no one's like, "How'd you pick that number 1?" Like, we're all like, "Yeah, definitely." Yeah. I think it's a true statement to the breadth of the quality of his work and the films he selected. Like, dude did there were some stinkers in there. You know, we won't get into it, but for the most part, Hackman. In the cast, you were like, okay, there's some quality here.
Yeah. Well, R.I.P. Gene Hackman. It's been a journey. Even though he hadn't been in a movie in a long time. I'm surprised none of us put Welcome to Mooseport in our top 5s.
I did have this is not. I was like, what if I did? What if I ended this with like?
I've actually never seen it. I've never seen it. I only know of it as like that's his last acting performance.
But to be,
I hate that he retired so young.
What I think is,
I mean, he wasn't that young, but I feel like he had another decade of movies, at least 5 years.
Yeah. I do kind of like that his next to last movie, which was Runaway Jury, which, to be fair, is not to be mentioned in the same breath as these other movies we've been talking about. It's a perfectly fine legal thriller, but I am glad that he kind of got to go out near the end with a buddy. You know, he's in it with Dustin Hoffman, and so it's kind of cool that he gets to top off this amazing career working with the guy that he got voted least likely to succeed with back in his younger years.
Well, guys, it's been a pleasure. Next week, I think we're going to recap the Oscars. Who do you guys think is going to win Best Picture?
Anora.
Who are you putting money on?
In fact, I was talking to someone last night, and they were like, well, what about, and they mentioned a couple of other contenders, and I said, Anora is in everyone's top 3, and this is a year where with the ranked choice voting being in the top 3 matters, and all the other contenders have people who are going to say that's not in my top 5. And Anora is in it's going to be Anora. I am, as crazy as it sounds, and I'm probably going to completely embarrass myself by saying this, I am as sure of Anora winning Best Picture as I am about almost anything other than Best Supporting Actor and Actress, which I think are the 2 most obvious choices. But I'm more sure about that than anything
I think
else.
That's
in the other major categories.
For similar reasons. That's why I kind of think it'll either be Anora or, like, if it's not Anora, it'll be like Conclave, of just sort of like the movie everyone is sort of like fun. That was fun seeing the Pope sneak around.
And if it's Anora, it'll be a year where we look back and say, oh, look, they got it right. Nice job. And if it's Conclave, it'll be a year where we're like, yeah, King's Speech beats Social Network, but King's Speech is still okay. You know, I don't think this is going to be a Green Book situation where
no,
it just makes
the Emilia Perez campaign seems to have like fully burned itself to the ground.
So yeah, this is a year that like whatever wins, it's not like I'm going to be like, this is bullshit. You know, like I'm going to be like, if it's not Anora, I'll be bummed, but I'm like, well, the other one's okay too.
That'll still be just, I mean, I've been going back and like rewatching some of Sean Baker's earlier movies that I'd never seen before, and it makes me all the more excited if that movie wins. Of just like how weird that is, and how cool that is. Of like Sean Baker is not like a Hollywood guy, and that'll just be so cool if that movie wins, and will be really weird and awesome. Well, guys, it's been a pleasure. We'll see you all next week. Fill out your Oscar brackets.